That was a big deal. So do you notice also the addresses?
Yes, I was mentioning, yes.
And before, New Jersey, there was no such thing as 08. They didn't have it at the time. Before was a separation. In other words, you had Camden 3, you had Camden 1.
Really?
And that's how you
The
separated.
county attended.
This was no more like that part of the city.
Who were like, management-wise, was very poor organization. I mean, when they came here, they were a poor organization.
And that was Willie Mays,
That
right?
stadium was the worst thing built in the United States at the time. Candlestick was the worst
Oh,
park in the
yes.
United States.
Because wasn't Willie Mays there in '52?
Yes,
in-
in fact,
in New York.
Willie, you know, Willie was in the Army. He was in the Army a year before me at Fort Dix. And I didn't play with him, but I knew a lot of guys that played with him. And he was, well, it was during the Korean War. You were drafted in the early 50s, because I got drafted when I was playing in the minor leagues. I got drafted. I was playing ball, I got the notice to report, which was like, I had
So is that the gap that's in your years? Is
You
there's
found that stuff?
I did.
Where'd
Yeah.
you find it on?
It's online.
Oh yeah, what is
Yeah.
it? I can't find it anymore.
Well, I'll
What's it?
send it to you.
What is it?
I'll send all that stuff to you. I found all
Okay,
that stuff.
I guess 5 years ago I was able to get in to get that and show my kids or my nephews or whatever.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you found that. That's good to see. And
Yeah, because there's a gap, and I was like, oh, I wonder what.
I was in the
That
Army.
was the
I was in
Korean
the Army.
War. You were in the Army.
Yeah, and my biggest problem was I went to spring training in '53, and like 2 weeks into spring training I hurt my back, and from then on I had chronic back problems. I would have 2 or 3 or 4 weeks real good, and then all of a sudden my back would go out, and then I'd have to have. I ended up going to a chiropractor, and I'd get snapped back in. I have to sit for a few days or a week or whatever, and then I'd play again, and I'd have that kind of problem periodically for years until I had major surgery after I was done baseball. I guess it was 10 years after I was out of baseball, I ended up having a spinal fusion
Oh my goodness.
because it was serious. It was major that I ended up crippled. I couldn't walk. I couldn't do anything. I was totally immobile. I had to have the surgery. I didn't want to do it. At the time, this goes back into the 60s, mid-60s, people were having a surgery like 3 or 4 years before that. They would be in a body cast for 6 months. Here, all the way down to here, when they had that fusion. And I heard people committing suicide because of that.
Oh my God.
Because it was getting on the toilet and doing all sorts of stuff was really a big deal. So 2 years before I had the surgery, they came up with spinal fusion, where you can go in, open up the back, go in, take bone marrow off the hip, put it around a few, what do you call that?
Vertebrae.
Pardon?
Vertebrae.
Vertebrae, and what do you call it? These round things, these
The discs.
discs.
Yeah.
They actually fused like 2 or 3 of my discs
Yeah.
with the bone marrow off of my hip. And they told me, no sports, no baseball, no hockey, nothing contact-wise, and no golf, no bowling, nothing where you would have this type of a problem. So I had to give up everything that I used to love. I couldn't do anymore. And then 10 years later, I broke the damn fusion again.
Oh my gosh.
I lifted a box out of the trunk of my car at the house. In fact, it was a bag of cement, which was stupid. But I was feeling so good. I was doing things I shouldn't have been doing because I felt so good. And I was active. My kids were growing up. I'd play catch with them and I would do things. But I wasn't doing real hard things. I wasn't bending it over or doing stuff. But I was doing too much at the time. But picking up that box, I really broke the fusion, and it took me like 3 or 4 months to get the guts to go in again, because the fusion at the time was, I mean, I was operating on with a fusion. I was totally immobile for 6 weeks. I was in bed with 4 sides, and I was laying on my back, And I think for how many days, I can't, maybe 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks, I was rolled from side to side in order to keep the fusion, making sure it was going to work. And I had a friend of mine come in and he says, I'm bringing you these periscope glasses because I could only lay on my back, I couldn't lay on my side, I couldn't have anything under my neck, I was flat. So he bought these periscope glasses, then I could lay back with my head, I could look at the ceiling and look at the television, or I could put a book on my lap and I could read. Before that I couldn't do anything.
Oh my God.
I was looking at the
Good
ceiling.
thing your wife's a nurse.
I mean, and I drove, my wife is a RN retired now, but she was a nurse at the time, and I was so bad, she quit on me. I pissed her off so much, and I was taking it out on her, instead of taking it out on the nurse, I was taking it out on her, and she told me, go to hell, and you're on your own, and I'm gonna get the nurse back in here, and so, I mean, that's how bad I was a real bitch. And it was a terrible, terrible thing to go through at that time. And 10 years later, I'm thinking I'm gonna have to go through the same thing again. Well, it was like taking a regular prop airplane and making a jet plane. That's how the surgery changed in 10 years.
Wow.
I went in, and they didn't have to take anything off of my hip. They went in off my spine, and then they took something off of my bone back here somewhere, so then I had to make 1 incision instead of 2 incisions. And then they went in and they were able to refuse me in the back and then stitch me up with no problem. Then they got me up in a couple days instead of being down all that time, and they put me in this body cast that I had from 10 years before, because I wore that for 6 months. It was like, it was these straps going across here, and it was all metal, stainless steel, covered with leather, and it came over my shoulder and came down right below my spine. And I had this big thing wrapped around here. I wore that for 6 months on the first surgery. And then the only time I have to take it off was sleeping, and when I was in the shower. I could shower, but I couldn't bend or I watched what I was doing. But eventually, after so many months, I was able to get rid of the corset, and I was able, at that time, I was in sales, outside sales and driving. I had to go buy a new car because with the brace on, I couldn't get into the car. The cars at that time were lower, and I couldn't bend my neck to get into the car. I had to make sure so I had to go look for a new car. I had to make sure I could get into the damn thing. I bought a Chevy at the time. And I was able to work and everything, selling and doing stuff, but I just had to watch my bending and stuff. I used my legs a lot to bend, and it was tough going to the bathroom and stuff, but I was able to do it. And so it was all caused because of baseball, and I had the Dodgers when I was in Indiana. I guess it was 1955. I was playing in Kokomo, Indiana, and the Dodgers sent me to Brooklyn, to a Brooklyn hospital. I can't remember the name, I got it written down somewhere. And they had me in traction for a week, and then they had me doing a million different things for another week. And they used their orthopedic surgeon to go over all this with me. And he told me at the time, he says, you playing short at second or third base, he says, you can't do it. He says, you're back with those twists and turns that you do in the infield. He says, if you played first base or the outfield, or he says, you'd be all right. But he says, it's too much for your back, and you're going to have trouble. Well, I'm going back and I'm playing baseball. I ain't going to quit. So I went back and I played the rest of the season. I had a good year. I think I hit 286 or something like that. And I was known as a fielder. I was a skinny kid, and I told you, slap hitter, So, I was singles and doubles, and I think in my career I hit 2 home runs or something. I wasn't, and today everybody hits home runs, but because the way I was taught at the time in spring training at Vero Beach, Tommy Holmes was a hitting instructor for the Dodgers. So I had him, instructing as well as all the other guys, had him as an instructor. And very seldom in the minor leagues with other teams you ever meet the hitting coach for the major leagues. I mean, you play in the minors, you're in the minors. At that time, that's the way it was. With Vero Beach being there, you met everybody. I met Walter Alston, Pete Reiser became a very good friend of mine. I don't know if you remember Pete Reiser.
Sounds familiar, yeah.
Well, if you went back into history, he was a fabulous ball player in the 40s. I think he was Rookie of the Year in 1941, and he was noted for running into walls.
Oh, he's the one.
He was such an outstanding ball player. He was the first of its kind to run into walls. And at the time, walls were cinder block. You had no wooden walls or any kind of method of putting a wall into the ground. You had cinder block because they had no way of having a post going into the ground and a wall or a fence of any kind. In those days, you had walls. You might have had some areas where you had the cross-stitched type fences, but very seldom, like in Ebbets Field, from what Pete told me, because he managed me one year, Pete Reiser, we became very good friends after I was done playing ball because he ended up becoming a coach in the major leagues, a hitting coach in the major leagues. So he had a lot of exposure because of his background. I mean,